May 1169. The Irish Sea, cold, unpredictable, and full of treachery, is cut by the bows of a small Norman fleet. On deck, knights in chainmail grip their shields, their eyes fixed on the Irish coastline. Many of these men are veterans, hardened by campaigns in Wales, Normandy, Aquitaine, and beyond. They carry siegecraft, cavalry charges, and the ruthless discipline that had reshaped Europe. Now, those tactics and ambitions were about to reach Ireland's shores and change its destiny forever.
In this series, we're covering the Norman Way in County Wexford, uncovering why they came here, who sent them, and how this small force changed the course of Irish history.
This invasion began with the desperation of one man, Diarmait Mac Murchada, King of Leinster. In 1166, he was overthrown by Rory O'Concobar, the High King of Ireland, and Tiernan O'Rourke of Breffni. The cause went beyond politics. It was rooted in personal vengeance. Years earlier, Diarmait had abducted Forgal, O'Rourke's wife. Now, she may have gone willingly, but the insult to the O'Rourke's honour was unforgivable. In Gaelic Ireland, a king's power rested on alliances. With O'Rourke and the High King against him, Diarmait's support collapsed. He then fled to Wales, the stronghold of the Marcher Lords. These were men who lived by the sword, used to constant raids, sieges, and shifting loyalties. Diarmait then crossed to Aquitaine, where Henry II held court. The king's domains stretched from Scotland to the Pyrenees. Henry gave no troops, but instead issued a royal licence, permission for his subjects to aid Diarmait.
And that royal approval transformed a private feud into a sanctioned campaign.
With Henry II's approval secured, Diarmait returned to the Welsh coast. His task now was to turn royal permission into a fighting force. He began personally appealing to the most ambitious lords, men with little to lose and everything to gain in Ireland. Robert FitzStephen was the first to commit. A seasoned knight and former governor of Pembroke Castle, he had been imprisoned for rebellion. Freedom came at a cost, and Ireland offered both redemption and reward. Next came Maurice FitzGerald, a half-brother of Robert FitzStephen, another powerful Norman Welsh lord, whose family name would echo across Irish history for centuries. Diarmait promised each of them more than just payment. He promised them land, lordship, and a foothold in rich but divided kingdom. In medieval politics, such promises were very risky business. Success would mean vast estates and treasures. Failure could mean exile and even death. Over the winter of 1168-69, plans were laid in secret. Ships were prepared, weapons sharpened, supplies gathered. In the port town of Wales, word spread that an expedition to Ireland was underway. Archers and infantrymen were recruited up from among local retainers and, of course, mercenaries. These were not massive armies by continental standards, but they were more disciplined and heavily armed compared to most of the Gaelic war bands in Ireland. The goal was not yet conquest of Ireland, at least not officially. It was basically to restore Diarmait to his throne in Leinster. But behind that mission lay the unspoken truth. The Normans never came to leave. By spring of 1169, the men were ready. The ship stood at anchor in Milford Haven, and the tide of Irish history was about to turn. In May of 1169, the fleet set sail. Around 400 men, 30 mounted knights, archers, and infantry. Their war horses were the real shock weapon of the campaign, the tanks of medieval warfare. Moving them across the sea was even a feat in itself, as the Irish Sea could turn violent within minutes. They timed their approach for the rising tide, slipping into Bannow Bay over the shifting sandbanks. The approach was treacherous. One wrong line and the ship could go ground, leaving it stranded and vulnerable to attack. But this hidden inlet offered something no other Wexford harbour could: concealment. The bay's narrow entrance shielded it from open sea lookouts, while marshland muffled the sounds of oars and anchors. Norman commanders were no strangers to amphibious landings. From England to Sicily, they had learned the value of arriving where the enemy least expected them. In Gaelic Ireland, the idea of a fleet slipping ashore without being spotted was rare, as at that time most attacks came over land, and that's what made Bannow so dangerous. It was a loophole. It was a door left unlocked. The vessels themselves were hybrids, clinker built like Viking ships, but taller sided for cargo and cavalry. Their high stems gave archers a vantage point if attacked. Now, once the fleet reached the calm waters inside the bay, anchors dropped, horses were slung, guided ashore by handlers waist deep in the water. War horses were as valuable as the knights themselves. They were trained not just for speed, but for the chaos of battle, to trample infantry, to charge into shield walls, and to carry an armoured rider without breaking stride. The choice of Bannow meant the Normans could unload at leisure, organise, and begin the march inland without harassment from enemy scouts. For the Gaelic Irish, the landing was invisible until it was too late. There were no early warning beacons, no signal fires. The first they knew was when the Norman army was already on the move. From this quiet shore, they would set out toward Wexford, a journey that would end in siege, surrender, and the first permanent Norman stronghold in Ireland. Now, when the Normans did arrive in Bannow Bay, as I said, they weren't met with resistance. In fact, they were met with open arms by Diarmait Mac Murchada and his army. Once ashore, the Norman commanders wasted no time. The objective was Wexford Town, the closest significant port and a prize that would anchor their presence in Ireland. The route inland was a mix of marsh tracks and rough farmland. This was May. The ground was firm, making the march easier for horses and supply carts. They moved in disciplined formations, columns, knights at the front, followed by infantry and archers, with the supply trains guarded at the rear. Weapons glinted in the sun: spears, swords, longbows, crossbows, you name it. In Ireland, the crossbow was almost unknown at that time, and its penetrating power would terrify the defenders. Word of the landing spread quickly. Messengers rode ahead to Wexford, warning the Norse Gaelic townsfolk and their Irish allies that an army was on the march. Wexford wasn't just another town. It was a wealthy maritime hub with Viking roots and a strong defensive perimeter. Founded by Norse settlers in the 9th century, Wexford thrived on trade, exporting hides, fish and wool and importing luxury goods from the Irish Sea. Its walls and gates had been improved over generations, and behind them stood a mix of stone houses, wooden halls, and narrow, twisting lanes. We have to keep in mind that at that time, before the arrival of the Normans, most structures in Ireland were made of wood. Now, for the Normans, taking Wexford would give them a secure harbour for reinforcements and a base for further campaigns into Leinster. You take Wexford, you take Leinster. The march took them across farmland and low hills, covering roughly 12 miles, just over 20 kilometres. Scouts moved ahead, ensuring no ambush lay in wait. Archers were the psychological weapon of the day. A Norman longbow could outrange Irish javelins and cause chaos before melee even began. By the time the Normans reached the outskirts of Wexford, the defenders had gathered a coalition of Norse townsmen and local warriors. The town's leadership faced a choice: fight an enemy with superior army and tactics, or negotiate before the siege began. But history shows that neither side was ready to yield, and the Battle of Wexford was about to begin. The Norman army approached Wexford in tight formation, their banners visible long before they reached the town walls. Inside, townsfolk and warriors took up positions along the timber reinforced stone ramparts, ready to defend their livelihoods, their families, and their town. Wexford's defences had been reshaped by centuries of Viking and Irish conflict. Ditches, palisades, and strong gates kept attackers at bay. The Normans were fewer in numbers than the defenders, but they had the advantage of siegecraft. They could bring archers close to the walls and rain down arrows down on the defenders' positions. Siege ladders, mantlets, and even the threat of fire were part of the Norman playbook. Weapons that towns like Wexford had rarely faced before. Archers loosed volleys of shots to suppress defenders, while infantry prepared to storm the gates. Mounted knights waited in reserve and ready to exploit any breach that could have come at any moment. The defenders fought back bravely with stones, spears, and javelins. They knew that the Normans could not sustain a long siege without supplies. Now, according to the song of Diarmait and the Earl, the fight lasted for about 2 days, and both sides suffered casualties. In fact, the Normans suffered more than the locals. But the psychological impact of the Norman assault was undeniable. Inside the walls, morale began to crack. The townsfolk knew that continued resistance could mean the destruction of their homes and livelihoods, and even their own lives. Some considered fleeing by the River Slaney, which is at the rear of the town, and others urged the leaders to negotiate before the Normans could storm the gates. Now, eventually, a delegation left the gates to speak with Diarmait and his allies. Their offer was simple: surrender in exchange for safety. The Normans agreed. Wexford opened its gates, and with it, Ireland had its first Norman held town. For the townsfolk, life would continue, but under new lords, new laws, and the shadow of a foreign power. For the Normans, Wexford was just the beginning. When the gates of Wexford opened, it was more than just a surrender. It was a turning point in Irish history. A Norse Gaelic stronghold that had resisted Viking sieges in the past now bowed to a foreign king's vassals. For Robert FitzStephen and his half-brother, Maurice FitzGerald, this was the fulfilment of a promise. Diarmait Mac Murchada had pledged them land and wealth in return for their swords, and Wexford was their down payment. The town was placed under joint Norman control, with charters issued to formalise their authority. These documents were alien to Gaelic Ireland, where law was traditionally oral and based on the Brehon system. For the townspeople, day-to-day life might have looked unchanged at first. The same markets, the same quayside chatter, but beneath the surface of it all, everything was shifting. Norman coinage began to appear in trade. Weights and measures were standardised, and tolls were enforced with a new discipline. The fall of Wexford gave Diarmait not only a port, but also the legitimacy that came from holding a fortified town with Norman backing. With the Wexford now secure, Norman and Leinster forces pushed into the countryside, raiding those who refused to submit. Castles were planned, churches were refounded under Norman patronage, and the Normans brought with them Romanesque stonework, vaulted arches, and an obsession with fortification. This was not no ordinary raid, nor was it temporary. It was the planting of a colony. They also brought feudal law. Land was no longer held in the Gaelic sense by clan and custom, but granted in fief to those who swore loyalty to their lords. It's here we see the strategic genius of the Bannow Bay landing. It secured a beachhead, captured a key port, and allowed the Normans to dictate the next moves. Over the following weeks, Norman envoys visited nearby lords, offering alliances or issuing threats. Many submitted, sensing the tide of history was turning. There was nothing they could do. Those who did resist were met with the same military precision that had taken Wexford. The message was clear. The Normans had come to stay. This was the first step toward a Norman-controlled Leinster, but it was also the beginning of a relationship between Gaelic Ireland and the Anglo-Norman power that would last for centuries. Economically, the Normans integrated Wexford into a larger network. Trade flowed to and from Wales and England, bypassing older Irish routes. Spiritually, they re-established churches, often in older monastic sites, aligning them with continental reform movements. Even burial customs began to shift, with the Norman symbols appearing on grave slabs alongside Gaelic motifs. Across the sea, Henry II kept a close eye on events. The Normans in Wexford were his subjects, and their success risked provoking tensions with other Irish kings. Diarmait's ambition now stretched beyond Leinster. His eyes were set on claiming the High Kingship of Ireland at the Hill of Tara, and the Normans were his ticket there. But success would bring more than allies. It would also bring rivals, even among the Normans themselves. The invasion was no longer a single man's quest. It was becoming part of a much larger imperial game. This quiet shoreline is where the Norman way began in Ireland, but the next steps would be even bolder. The Normans would follow the coast, building castles, seizing strongholds, and reshaping Wexford forever. The journey along the Norman way was just the beginning, and their next target lay further south, the strategic headlands and harbours of South Wexford. Each site would become a stepping stone, each fortification a statement that the Normans were not invaders passing through, not raiders.
Next time, we follow their
pirates.
advance inland and
They
the
were
battles
settlers.
that decided the fate of the southeast.